Hello and welcome. My name's Dave. Today we're going to build a to-do web app, and we're going to use HTML, CSS, actually Sass that compiles to CSS, and then JavaScript for the functionality. And we want our web app to be mobile first and responsive. So of course designed for mobile phones, but then also ready to scale up for tablet size viewports and then larger widescreen computer monitors or possibly even TVs. And then we want our web app to be accessible. And by accessible, I mean accessible with a keyboard, using the tab index and the enter key, or also using a screen reader. And then we want to use persistent data, and that means we can close out of our web app, come back a week later, reopen the browser, load up our web app, and our to-do list will still be there with all the items we had on it. Let's get started. I would like to thank freeCodeCamp for sharing my video, and Bo, Quincy, and everyone involved in making freeCodeCamp such a great resource. A quick note about me: I'm the father of some great kids, and some have autism. Please check out my YouTube channel, and you can connect with me on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Reddit. Okay, we're starting our project with a blank slate. You can see over here I have a folder named to-do_list. I've got VS Code open. And we should start with the HTML. That is the foundation and the framework for anything else we might do. We'll start with a file called index.html. And in this file, we'll first use an Emmet shortcut. Just type the exclamation mark and you can see Emmet abbreviation, I should say, right here. We'll choose that and it puts in a basic page outline. Now I'm going to hit Alt-Z, and that will wrap this line that we couldn't see here before. So now you can see line 5 is just a little deeper, and that's because I'm wrapping the line that it put in here. So now we'll put in some of our own custom information. We need all of these lines, especially this viewport line that will help make our project responsive. And we will later on, we'll put in a style sheet line, a script tag for our JavaScript and that sort of thing. Right now, we'll just change the title from document to to-do list. Save that, and we've basically got our basic head section right now. So now we need to go ahead and put some things in the body. And I like to use semantic elements when possible. We'll start with a main element. Of course, this also helps our accessibility. It's a great habit to have instead of just using divs. And now our project, as you can see, the finished project over here to the right, is really broken down into two sections. We've got the area where we add a new to-do list entry, and then we have the area that actually contains the list. And that's how we're going to break this out, is into two sections. And so we'll put in section elements. There's our first section, and this is going to be the new item entry. So let's give it a class that says exactly that. Having trouble typing again. New item entry. And now that we've got our section, what this section is really going to hold is a form. You can see this is an input, it's a text input, and this is a button, which is a submit button. And that's basically what's inside this new item entry. So let's start with the form, and we'll give it an ID of item entry form. Now inside the form, we want to have a label for the input. Again, this will help with accessibility. We'll call this label, well, it's for new items, so we'll actually call the input new item. And in the label, we'll put enter a new to-do item. Well, we don't even need the period. There we go. And now it's time for the input. And as I said, it will be called new item. So in the label, the for attribute names the ID of the input attribute. And this will be a text input, so we'll put type text. Let's cap the size at 40 characters. And we'll set autocomplete to off. You may want it on yours. Of course, that's when it gives a list of suggestions or things you have previously typed underneath. That's always kind of annoying to me, so I'm just going to turn it off. A placeholder, and this is the text like you see add item. That is the actual placeholder that goes inside the text input. Of course, I need to put an equals there. Add item, and then a tab index, and this makes sure it is keyboard accessible. It is part of the keyboard index when you tab through the items. So we definitely want this input to be part of that. We put a tab index of 0. Oh, and then we can just slash close because that doesn't have a closing tag for the input. It's just a slash and then close out the element. Okay, what would go after that? The button. And it is just a button element. Let's give it an ID of add item. Yeah, that makes sense. Add item. Class, let's just create a button class because we're going to have another button, as you can see later, for the clear as well. The title attribute of this should be add new item. And title is what, when you mouse over, text will pop up and show. Now I can't show you that when the DevTools are open because I just get this kind of 0 and it doesn't do it. But if I were to close DevTools and mouse over, you would see the title there. That's add new item. I'm going to give this button an ARIA label. This is part of the accessibility that we want to create for this web app. And here I'll put add new item to list. Now why did I do that? Well, there is no text on the button. It's just a plus symbol. And that's not really descriptive for anyone that is using a screen reader. So this ARIA label will help out with that. And let's also give this a tab index of 0. And we'll close that. And now the button, as you can see, does have a closing tag as well. We're just going to put the plus symbol in here. That's what you actually see on the button. So now we've got our form. It's got a label, an input, and a button element. And that's the first section. So I'll save that. Now let's create the next section. And this section is for the container that has the list. So we'll give this let's give this a class equal to list container. Now inside this section we are going to create some divs at this point. The first one, div with a class equal to list title. And this will be this area here that has the title and it has the button. It's just the top of the list. So inside this, we will put the title, we'll give that an H1, and you really only want one H1 per page, and this will be the one for this page or for this app. And now we'll also put a button here, and this will be the clear button. So this button is going to have an ID equal to clear items. The class, just like the other button we created, will be will be button. Totally get that turned around. The title is going to be equal to clear the list. Remember, that's what pops up when you mouse over the button. And let's also give this an ARIA label because just saying clear, it gives a hint, an indication of what the button does, but it's not as descriptive as we could be. So we'll say ARIA label, and remember this is what a screen reader would read. Remove all items from the list. That seems good. Oh, and then a tab index again because this button also needs to be part of the tab order of the page. And we'll close that. And of course, a button has a closing element as well, or a closing tag for the element. And we'll put clear in as the text for the button like you see up here. Go ahead and save that. Now, that should pretty much be it for that div. But underneath the div, we have a horizontal rule, this line you see. So we can create that with just the horizontal rule element and close it out at the same time. It doesn't have its own closing tag. So just like that input element, it just has a slash at the end of the element. Okay, now our next div, and this is for the list itself. So create a div and give it an ID equal to list items. Now really that's all we're going to need in our page. The rest is dynamically created. When we add an item, it adds it to the list, and that will be created with JavaScript. But when we style the page, it will be helpful to see an item or two in there before we start working with the JavaScript. So you kind of want to plan ahead and know what you want to create with your JavaScript. Don't just wing it. So inside of here, we'll put a couple of items that later on we can remove. And each item will be created with a div. We'll give each item a class of, as you might expect, item. And then inside each div will be an input, as you can see, the checkbox, and then a label for that checkbox. And by using these elements that are built into HTML, that once again helps us with our accessibility. We're not creating some new text node or something like that, or just some div that we have to make accessible later. A label is already associated with a checkbox in HTML. So screen readers will respond to this by just using a checkbox and a label. So we'll put an input element, and this type of input is a checkbox. And then each list item in our to-do list will have an ID number. So here we'll just do ID of 1. Remember, we're just speccing this out. Later on, we'll remove these. And they'll be part of the tab order of the web app. So we'll give that a tab index of 0 also, so it's included in the tab order. Now this input needs a label, and it will be for whatever ID number the to-do item has. So in this instance, it will be for ID of 1, and then we just say whatever we want to say. And here is eat. We've got eat, sleep, code. So there we go. There's an example item. Let's just copy this and put in at least one more. So we'll say 2, and sleep. Other than that, it's the same. And there we have finished the HTML for the project. And remember, these items are just here for now. We will remove them, and they will be generated with JavaScript. But we're putting these in because we want to style this next, and we'll see what we get when we start styling the page. Okay, let's get started styling our HTML. You can see we have what the finished product should look like here. And we have the HTML we created here. And I have started the live server. You can do that by clicking right on your HTML and use Open with Live Server. If you don't have Live Server already in VS Code, go to the icon over here for extensions, type in Live Server, and here it is. Go ahead and install Live Server, and then you'll be able to do the same thing. You want to run a local server, and it makes it really easy to do with Live Server. So you get the Live Server extension, right-click, choose Open with Live Server, which I've already done, and in this other tab, here's our HTML. Doesn't look quite as good as the finished product yet, but it is the same HTML. So we need to go ahead and style that HTML. Let's look at the file tree here, and all we have is our index.html file. I want to add a folder. I'm going to call this folder Sass. And now you see I have a Sass folder, and we'll include Sass files in here. Actually, there'll be files that end in the extension SCSS, because that's the style of Sass I'm going to use. Now, Sass is very much like CSS3, but it gives us a few other advantages to go along with that. So the first file we'll create in this Sass folder is going to be style.scss. And now that we have a Sass file as well, we need to add another extension, and one that will look at our Sass and will compile it to CSS as we create it. So once again, come to the extension icon over here, and instead of Live Server, type in Live Sass, and we're looking for Live Sass Compiler. You can see it's my third result here. I'll click on that. Install Live Sass Compiler, and that's exactly what this will do. It will take your Sass files, it will merge them because we are going to create more than one file, and it will compile them all down to one CSS file. And now that you have that, we come back here, we can click the button that says Watch Sass, and this will start to compile our Sass. So I've created that. Now you can see it went to the output window here, and it will start to look for that. Now I really don't need that right now, and matter of fact I can close it and it will continue to watch. See, it says watching, and what it did when I clicked that was automatically created my dist folder, which stands for distribution, and inside that folder I have a CSS folder, and inside the CSS folder the live Sass compiler created a style.min.css file. It also created a map, because that's the default. I haven't changed that. We don't really need the map, but it doesn't hurt anything. This minified CSS, and that it will actually be minified code, is what's created when live Sass compiler does that. Now there are some settings that we could look at quickly. If we come to Preferences in VS Code and go to Settings, and then I type in live Sass, we'll get to the live Sass compiler settings, and you can see it's got a few different settings. Auto prefix, exclude list, formats, and formats is what we'll look at. And notice it has a settings.json. It says edit in settings.json. So I probably have settings that aren't the default. I don't really remember what the default settings were, but I can show you what I've changed mine to. So the format that I have in this settings JSON says compressed, and that means it's going to compress the CSS down to a minified version. Then there's an extension name, and I end my file with .min.css, which is the standard to kind of tell you that file is compressed. And then it has the save path, and I like to save mine to a distribution folder. And in the future, if you start using a bundler like Webpack, this will make more sense. But I save to a distribution folder and then the CSS folder. And so those are the settings that I have. You may have different default settings, and that would be okay too. I just wanted to show you how to get to those settings if you want to change them. And so now our live Sass compiler is watching anything we do, and it will compile that Sass right away. And the live server is watching for changes, and as there are changes, it will automatically update what is served from our local server, and we will see it over here in Chrome. So that is all ready to go. Now our style page is really just going to pull in other files we create. And on the Sass website, it shows how to do this with the use or @use. However, live Sass compiler doesn't seem to be supporting that, at least the version that I have. You can look at the Sass page, and I'll link to that in the video description. And of course, look at a tutorial for Sass, and you can see if your version of live Sass compiler is supporting use. But right now, I need to type import is the way I can pull in a file with the version I have. And I'm going to pull in a base file. And we may get an error at first because it doesn't exist, but I'll highlight this folder once again, and I'll create this base file. And you say base with an underscore because this is a Sass partial. And Sass knows it's a partial because it starts with the underscore. So our style file will look for this base partial, and we'll start writing what looks a lot like CSS in this base file. The very first thing I like to do in my base file is start to define colors. And I can do that because Sass supports variables. And so I define the first color usually with a default font color. And the reason this is handy is because then I know one place to go in my Sass files that has all of the colors for the project. And then I'll just refer to these variables in the project. So I'm going to define a few starting colors here. I've got a background color, and this color is a shade of blue that I like, 90E2, and then we'll have a container, and I'll abbreviate background color, and here will be an off-white, and then a container border color. Yeah, it's just one word. It's fine, just so it makes sense to you and anybody else that reads it if they need to work on your code. And as long as you spell out what it is, a good description like that should work for your variable name. So there's 4 color names to start with. I'll save that. And let's see what else we should put. Well, I'll use media queries later, of course, to make this project responsive. And Sass also supports something called mixins. And we start out with just saying @mixin. And now I'll put an MP here. And we'll put in the size variable, and a thank you to Kevin Powell, who has a great channel on web design. And he is originally who I learned this from instead of typing out all these media queries. And it's a great way to do it. So we don't have to type all of this stuff except one time. Media only screen, and then we'll put min width and size here. It's where we pull in our size parameter. And now we can just put @content. And that will be our mixin for future use when we need to use a media query. Now we can start what looks more like just regular CSS. And I start with a reset. We've got the asterisk, and that means select all. This applies to all elements, everything on the page. I've got a margin of 0, padding of 0, and I like to put box sizing in my reset. And we'll set that at 0. And then I start with HTML and body. And I apply these to both elements. And we put in some basics for the page or the web app. And the first is font size, 16 pixels. I never like to go below that, and we set that as our base for the project. And then font family is another one, and we're going to pull in a font from Google Fonts. So we'll take a moment to look at that in just a second, but I'll go ahead and tell you what one I'm going to use. I like the font Montserrat. And then we'll back that up just in case it wouldn't load with sans serif. Okay, color, and this is the text color, so we go to our default font color that was available. Width, we want 100% width on the HTML and body elements. Min height, 100%. And then we're going to include a media query. So we'll include, now we say MP, like we defined above, and 768, which is the iPad size. So once we've got to tablet size from phone size, and we want to remember that we're starting with a mobile first design. And you can see we have a mobile phone view over here, actually an iPhone 8 layout in Chrome in the Dev Tools, and this of course is the finished product. We want to start small and build our way up. And if we need to change things as the page gets bigger or as the viewport gets bigger, we can do that. So the only thing I'm really sizing up is the base size of the font. As the page gets bigger, we're just taking that font and going from a base of 16 pixels to 22 pixels. Now you can see in everything else we're going to add to the project, we're not going to refer to a font size with a pixel anymore. We will use REMs, which will always come back and refer to this base size we've set in the HTML and body. Okay, let's save this, and now let's add a couple of things to the body alone that we're not going to add on to the HTML. And one is padding. So 20 pixels all around. And then the background color. And we'll use the background color we defined. From there, we can go to the section. And remember, we've got 2 sections. Here you can see we've got the background color we just set on the body is that blue color. And now we've got our 2 sections we're working with. So you can tell they will not be as wide as the viewport. They will have a different background color. So let's set that background color. And it will be the container background color that we defined, kind of that off-white. And then we'll set the width to 90%. Now it doesn't look like this is really a 90% width, but remember we set padding of 20 pixels as well on the body. So 20 pixels in from all sides, And then instead of using 100% of the available width, we're using 90% of the available width. So we've already subtracted 40 pixels from the possible width, and then we're only using 90% of what's left. Okay, max width, 700 pixels. So when we get to a larger screen, we don't want this to continue growing beyond 700 pixels. Margin, we'll set those to auto, and you can see that's why the sections are centered. We've got a margin left and right that is set to auto. And now a border, 1 pixel solid, and we'll come back to our container-border color that we defined. And then we'll round the corners with a border radius of 10 pixels. Now, why don't we see this applying to our HTML yet? Well, let's go ahead and take a look at this HTML. And we'll hide the file the file tree for a second so we can see everything a little better. And we don't have it linked yet. We haven't linked our Sass or the finished product, which is the CSS, is what we really need to link. We haven't linked that to our HTML yet, so of course we're not going to see that. Let's link it right up here above the title. We'll put link and then rel attribute equals style sheet and then href, and this will link to what we have. And you can see the dist folder, and then there's the CSS folder, and then there's style.min.css. So Visual Studio Code was helping us out with everything. And as we save that, now you can see what we get. Doesn't look great yet. Let's go ahead and get the Google font Montserrat that we talked about as well. And what you want to do is go to fonts.google.com, and there type in Montserrat, if I'm pronouncing that correctly even, and then we click on the result, and it will give us a list of available styles. And if I remember right, I chose medium 500. So if you click select this style, it actually gives us the link we can copy. And then of course it says what to put in our CSS rules, which is what I did earlier. We had the font family and it's Montserrat, and back that up with sans serif. So we'll just copy this link, and we will put this link in our HTML. Oh, there's something I must have forgot. I put a semicolon there instead of just closing out the link tag. There we go. Now let's go ahead and put this above the style sheet we're creating, so this style sheet can actually use the Montserrat font family as well. So we'll save that, and now we can get rid of that, and we have it. It doesn't look much better, but we are using the correct font that we want to at this time. Okay, we're ready to add another partial, and that is for our shared classes between the buttons. So let's show the file tree once again, and we want to add a partial file named _sharedclasses.scss. Now I want to define a few more colors before we get started on the buttons. So we'll start with text box dash border color, because that is going to be right up there where we're working with the text box and the first button. And then we'll have button text color, and that will be white. And then we'll have button hover color, and that's when the mouse hovers over the button. You can set that to dark or black. And then we can have an add button color, and that is where we're adding an item. So that's going to be a green, and that is 4CAF50. And then we'll have our clear button color, and that will be 9F6060. There we go. So we've got all the colors we need. Let's come over to the shared classes partial, and we'll start adding some code for these button classes. So the first class is just button, and that's what we added in the HTML. We'll set the width to 15%. Whoa, I need the percent. Now we'll set the min width to 48 pixels and the min height to 48 pixels. And that is the minimum size you want a button, especially when it is mobile friendly, because that is where you'll have your thumb or your fingerprint, your fingertip. And if I remember right, I read this from Google Dev Advocates, but you don't want a button smaller than that. 48 pixels by 48 pixels is pretty much the minimum mobile friendly size for a button for your finger to fit on it properly. So 48 by 48 are the min width and height settings there. And now for the color, we'll go with button-text color that we set earlier. And now border, 2 pixels, solid, and we'll go with the text box border color we set. Now we didn't set it specifically for the button, but it's right beside that text box, so I'm just going to use the same one. And border radius, 10 pixels. That'll give it that rounded feel instead of just being squared off and sharp corners. And then I'm going to set the outline to none, and this is usually not good. And let me tell you why this is not good. It needs to be visually, you need to somehow see, I guess, that the focus is on the button. So something visual needs to happen. And usually that is an outline. Many screen readers will outline by default anyway. But you don't want to remove the outline if you don't have another plan for the hover and the focus. But we do. So let's set those next. We'll take that button class and we'll choose the hover. And the first thing we want to do is just change the cursor to a pointer. And that's where the cursor changes from the arrow to the little hand with the finger pointing. And now the next thing we want is not only button hover, but I'll put a comma, and then we also want to choose button focus. And now here we're going to do a couple of things. One is set this filter property. We'll change the brightness, and you can see it accepts a parameter, and we'll set that to 120%. That means it's going to get brighter when we mouse over or focus on the button. It will lighten up the color, so that should be a visible change. We're also going to set a box shadow, which is kind of an outline in itself. So we'll set that to 4 pixels, 2 pixels, 5 pixels, and black, kind of like a shadow. Now that we've added our button classes, let's go ahead and import that partial. We'll save that, and let's see what we've got going in the live version of our code that we're creating so far. Again, this is the example version that we'd already created to start out the project. And here's what we've got. Now I need to close DevTools so you can actually see some of that hover or mouse over in action. You can see it brightens up the button, although we haven't styled the button the way we want to yet. And we also brighten up this button, but we haven't applied the specific colors or anything like that to the buttons yet, but we will. Okay, we'll come back into DevTools. There we go. Let's look at this example again. Of course, we want these colors on the buttons, and there's some other things we're going to add as well. So we've got the shared classes partial and the base partial. Now we want to go ahead and tackle each section on its own, and the next section or partial we will add. We could go ahead and do that here first. Import, and we will call this new item entry. So we need to add a file, a partial file that has the same title, new item entry.scss. Although note, we don't have to put the file extension here. Sass knows to look for these types of files. So now in the new item entry, SCSS, we'll start out with that class, and that is what we applied in our HTML as well. New item entry. And now everything inside this, because Sass supports nested styles, everything inside this class will only be, well, it will only target what's inside this class. So this is a parent, is a way to put that. So if I just say input at this point, it's only going to look for an input inside this class because it's nested. I want to start out with the position sticky though. And that is because if our list gets long enough, I don't want our add item area to scroll off the screen. So we'll make it so when it gets to 0, it'll just stick and stay at the top, and the rest of the list can scroll underneath. And we do that with position sticky and top 0, just those two settings. And you'll only see that if you get a really long list and then scroll through the list, and it'll just stop right there, which we can try that out later. Margin on the bottom of this we'll set to 1 rem, and then padding we'll set to 0.75 rem. And those are our main styles just for the container, the new item entry container. Now, once again, inside the class, we're going to use nested styles, and the first thing we're going to target is the form. Because remember, the rest of this is a form, and it has the text input and the submit button. So this display is going to be flex, and we're going to justify the content to space between, and that will have these two items, the input and the button, going as far left and as far right as they possibly can. So I'll go ahead and save that, and let's see what changes are being implemented here. Yeah, it looks a little different than it did before. It's definitely not what we want yet, but we're working on it. Now, inside the form, we have a label, but you don't see the label. Let's look back at the main one. You don't see the label here. You see the placeholder text, but the label's nowhere to be seen. But we still have a label, and that is for accessibility. However, I'm going to style the label way off the screen. I'll put the position as absolute, and then I'm going to send it left, and I'll put minus 10,000 pixels. And that will take that label way off the screen, but a screen reader will still read that label because it relates to the input. And now we can target the input, and we probably could just say input, but since we have a button, which is a submit type, and you could have an input with a type submit, and then it would show up as a button, it gets confusing. So I'm going to just get a little bit more specific here. I'll say input type equals text. And so that's a way you can see how to make a more specific selector there based on the input type. And I'll set the width to 80%. Font size is going to be a little bit bigger than the standard, so 1.25 rem. And then border, 2 pixel, solid, text box, border color, and then border radius, 10 pixels once again to round those edges. Padding, 0.75 rem, that'll give a little bit of space inside the text. And then once again, I'll set this outline to none, but then I have to make sure I'm doing something with that input when we get there. So we will have a focus and hover setting for this input. Let's look at the changes now. That looks a little better. We're getting there. Okay, so what will we do for the input? And once again, I need to specify type equals text. Oh, focus, comma, yep. And then input, once again, type equals text, and hover. Now let's add a box shadow to that input. And let's come back and look at that again. We'll close the DevTools here, and we've got a box shadow over the text. When we hover or when it has focus, the box shadow stays. So that is what we wanted there. Let's come back to DevTools. And we can add a few more things here. So we've got the input taken care of. And this is our specific button. Now, even though we have our button class in our shared classes partial, we have a button specific to our item entry area. And so within that class, we're going to target this button, or this button element, put font size, it's 1.25 rem, background color, it's going to be our add button color, padding 0.75 rem, at include, let's include our media query, font size of 1.5 rem when the page gets up to tablet size. And that's where we just increase the font size a little bit to scale up with the size of the page. And let's save all of that. Okay, we have one more partial to add, and that is for our list container styles. And so we will add the extra partial to our Sass folder, and we're going to call it underscore list container.scss. And we'll need to remember to go to our style and include that with the import statement. And we'll say underscore list container, just to import that partial as well. Okay, in the list container itself, the first thing we want to do is name the class, the same class we used in our HTML. And once again, everything will be nested within this class. We'll set just a couple of properties for the class itself. We'll put a minimum height of 60 viewport height. That's what I call it, viewport height units. It's kind of like 60%. Whatever the viewport height is, the minimum height of this will be 60% of the viewport height. And so that gives it some room. If you don't have much in your list at that point, it'll still expand at least to that 60%. And I think it looks just a little bit better. Okay, padding, we'll go ahead and add 0.75 rems here as well. And now let's get into the list title. If you remember, we had that list title class nested within, and that has the to-do list title. It has the clear button in this section right here. We're going to display in a flex display, flex box is what we're using. Justify the content. Again, we'll do the space between like we did at the top for our form. So that'll take things far left and far right. And here we're going to align items, and we'll put flex end instead of at the beginning. From there, we'll look at the button that is inside the title. Say font size 1 rem, background color. Here we'll do the clear button color we defined. Now for padding, going to set the top to 0, and then we'll set, well, the top and the bottom to 0 actually, and then we'll set the sides to just a little bit of padding, 1 or 0.1 rem, just to give it just a hair of padding. Okay, margin at the bottom, 0.5 rem. That's just to give it a little bit of space between the horizontal rule we have at the very bottom and the button. Okay, and let's add a media query with the include. And remember, we defined our mixin media query, and this is once again when it reaches the size of an iPad tablet. We're going to change that font size. Now let's not change the font size. It can just stay where it's at. Let's add padding, just a little more padding. So the top still and the bottom still has 0, but the sides will now have 0.5 instead of 0.1 rem. Okay, there's a little bit. Now, besides the button, we also have a horizontal rule that we can do something with. And we'll just set that width to 100%. So it goes all the way across, except there's a little bit of space here where we have that padding that we defined up here at the beginning of the container. So that padding is in the container, but it takes up 100% of the width available to it. Okay, so we're in the list container and we defined everything in the list title area. Now our buttons look right. Of course, here our title looks correct also, and we do have the horizontal rule. So that's all good. So now we need to go to the item area. And if you remember in the HTML, the item area is where we start adding those list items. Here we have our list item, and inside that were the items themselves. And we're going to dynamically create these items in our app. So we need to go ahead and style those. Let's get back to our list container. And we've got the list title class, and we're finished with that. So now let's just go to the item class. And we'll also set that display to flex. And we'll justify the content. And we'll set that content to flex start. So this starts at the very top. And then we'll also align items here. And we'll center those items. And we'll set the padding on the top to 1 rem. We need a little bit of space there. Okay, the inputs. The inputs, if you remember, are checkboxes. So here we'll specify the type equals checkbox. And we'll get a little room for the definition. We'll go text align center. And we'll have the width, and that will be 2.5 rem to get a little bit bigger checkbox there. The minimum width, kind of look at this like a button, because once again, could be touching that. So we want 48 for min width. Min height will also want 48 pixels, just like we treated the buttons. And then height itself, which maybe we should have put here before the min height. Height will set to 2.5 rem also. Underneath the min height, we can switch the cursor to a pointer, just like we would for buttons. And then margin on the right, because we want to give some space between the checkbox and the label, we'll set to 1.5 rem. Now let's go ahead and add something for the focus that will help our accessibility. Once again, identify the checkbox input, and we'll say focus, but now there's one more thing to add here, plus label, because this is the label out to the side where you see eat and sleep, or in the finished version you see eat, sleep, code. This is because when we tab through, say using a keyboard, or when we'd select the item, but when we tab through and this item has focus, we want to underline those to-do items. We need to give it that extra visual for each item, like the word eat or sleep needs to be underlined. And here we can do that with a text decoration and underline that to-do item. And then for label itself, and this is the label, which is also the to-do item here, font size will set to 1.1 rem, just a little bit bigger than normal. And let's go ahead and save that. Oh, this looks much more like it. Okay, a quick correction. I was trying to figure out why I was scrolling left and right, and yet the original that I had designed was not, of course, and it shouldn't be. I went back and I was in a hurry, and on box sizing, after setting margin and padding to 0, I made the mistake of putting a 0 for box sizing. We don't want that. We want border box is the value that we need. And now you will see, well, it's still moving just a little bit here, but I think if we close DevTools, as this sometimes happens, and then if I put it back into, there we go, put it back in Now it's not scrolling left and right at all. Sometimes you have to open and close DevTools to get your mobile simulator to adapt just right. So now it won't scroll left and right at all, and that's exactly what we want. So everything is as it should be with the border box setting. I had mistakenly set that to 0 before. With that, our Sass is completed, our app is styled, and we are ready to move on to the JavaScript. We're now ready to move on to the JavaScript of our project, and so we want to create a JavaScript folder. Let's go ahead and just name that JS. And inside the JavaScript folder, we're going to have more than one file. Let's start out with a to-do list.js file, and I want to create a class for our to-do list. This isn't going to be an app where we can have multiple to-do lists. We're just going to have one major to-do list, and so it's not too complicated. We'll start with an export, and this will be the default export. As a matter of fact, the only class in this file, and it will be a to-do list. So we have to have a constructor. And this constructor will have this dot underscore list, and it will equal an empty array to start out with. And now we'll have a few methods, or kind of a getter and setter, if you will. We'll definitely have a get list. And with that, we will return this dot underscore list. We'll also have a clear list. So we can empty out the contents of the list. And for that, we'll just set it equal to an empty array once again. And what else can we add? Add item to list. Now here we'll need an item object because each to-do is going to be its own object. And with this one, we'll have this dot underscore list dot push item object, and we'll push the item into the array. And then of course we need to be able to remove one item from the list. So we'll have remove item from list, and we'll supply the ID of the to-do item when we remove it. This will be just a little bit longer than the other methods we've added here. So we'll define a list, and it will be equal to the list. And then we'll say for let I equal 0. Then while I is less than the list length, we will loop through. And now we'll say if the list item, which would be represented by the list with the iterator in bracket notation, and then dot underscore ID. So this is specifically the ID number. If it equals the ID, and we're not using a strict equals here, that's because we're going to grab the ID from the DOM, and we'll just grab it right out of the attribute. So it won't necessarily be a number. It will probably be a string value at that point. And so we'll just use the 2 equal signs instead of the 3 for strict equals. And at this point, we can splice to remove the item, and we'll start with the iterator, and then we'll use the number 1 because we're only removing that one element from the array, and then we're finished with the loop, so we can break at that point. We'll save that, and there is our to-do list class. Now we need to create a to-do item class, which will also be fairly simple. So let's go ahead and add another file. We'll call this to-do item.js. And in to-do item.js, it'll start out much the same way. Export default class to-do item. Now, unlike the list, we're going to create many to-do items. We'll start with a constructor. It'll be this dot underscore ID equals null to start out with. This dot underscore item will equal null also. No predetermined values there. So then we'll have a getter, a get ID. It's going to return this dot underscore ID. Then we'll have a setter with a set ID. And I prefer to use methods named like this rather than the get and set keywords. It just reads better to me throughout the code. It's easy to see what's going on. Oh, and with the setter, we need to pass in the ID as a parameter. We'll have this dot underscore ID equals ID. Now we'll also get the item. And we'll return this dot underscore item. And then we'll have a set item. And here we need to pass in the item. We'll have this dot underscore item equals item. And that is our to-do item class. So you can see we just really have the two properties in the constructor, and we have getters and setters for each of those properties. Okay, we'll put the rest of the JavaScript for this project in a file that I typically name main.js. main.js. And in this main.js file, the first thing we want to do is import our to-do list from the to-do list .js, and then we'll import to-do item from to-do item. There we go, .js. And then we'll create a to-do list object from the to-do list class. So it's a new to-do list. And now at this point we haven't added the script tag to our HTML yet, so we'll need to go back and do that. And we'll come up to the top. I'm going to go ahead and hide the file tree again just so we can see a little better. And we need to add that script tag. And when we add the script tag, and I'll do that below the CSS link, we identify the source, starts in our JS folder, and then it will be our main.js. But we also need to add type equals module because we're using imports. And it has the closing script, and that should be good. We'll show the file tree once again, and we'll go back to the main.js file. Now I can probably hide that and give us a little more room. And we'll go ahead and get started by adding the very first function. And that function should be what listens for the load event that we're listening for. But it's not specifically the load event, but we're going to add a document and then an add event listener directly to the document. And we're listening for the ready state change. And with that event, we will fire, we'll listen here if event.target.readyState. We'll listen for that, and now a strict equals complete, and that means the DOM is fully loaded and ready to interact with. If we get to this point, we're ready to launch our init app function. And so now we're ready to get started. And what would go in our init app? Well, we won't add everything right away, but our init app, and I'll make an arrow function here for it, will have our event listeners. So we're going to add listeners here. And then it's also going to have a couple of procedural items that we're going to call, other functions we're going to make. And so I'll put here procedural things that we want to do right when the app loads. One is going to be to load our list or our list object. And especially if we store that in any persistent data, if we use our web storage API to do that, we're going to want to load those list items out of there when we come back to visit, so they're still there. The other thing we want to do is refresh the page. And that can have a few items within it. So let's go ahead and create that function right now. So our refresh the page function is what would be called into action. So we need to create that function below it. And it is going to contain a few helper functions, kind of a procedural function of its own. So we'll define refresh the page. Doesn't need any parameters. And one thing we're going to do is clear the list display. So that's a function on its own. Another thing we're going to do is render the list. A third thing we will do is clear the item entry field. That would be that text input where we're entering things. We don't want leftovers hanging out there. And the final thing we want to do is set the focus on the item entry field. We don't want to be somewhere else and always have to click in the box or tab back to it. We always want the focus set back to that item entry and ready to go right when the page loads or whenever we decide to refresh the page. So there we essentially have a procedural function here that's calling 4 helper functions, and we'll start with the clear the list display. So how will we do that? We'll define our clear list display function, which will also be an arrow function. And from there, we need to define a parent element. So that's exactly what I'm going to call that variable. And we'll select the parent element from the document with the document get element by ID. And we're going to look for the list items container. That will be the parent element for all of the list items. And now we're going to create another helper function that deletes the contents of whatever element we feed this function. So we need to feed it a parent element, and that's what we defined. So one more helper function here. And we're breaking these into smaller functions because they're easier to manage, and you really only want your functions to do one thing if they're not procedural functions. And a procedural function like refresh the page should be calling these other functions that are only doing one thing each. And sometimes when we get something like clear the list display, if we determine that it needs its own helper function, we can break that out as well. So now let's define this delete contents. And this delete contents function isn't necessarily just for this web app. This could be used in a variety of web apps. And honestly, it's a function that I use in almost every web app that I create with Vanilla JavaScript, because it's just a function that will delete all of the child elements of a parent element. So let's go ahead and define that. Let's say let child, and we'll set it equal to, oh, we need to pass in the parent element. We were calling that before, so I'll just call it the same thing here, parent element. Let child equal parent element, and then last element child. And then we'll say while child, so while there is a child element, we'll say parent element dot remove child. That's a method, and we'll pass in the child. So it removes the child while there is a child. And then the child is going to equal the parent element dot last element child once again. And that is, if there is another one, then you reset it to that last element child, and you continue that process until they're all gone. So we can save that. And now our clear list display function is complete. So we call that, and it selects the parent, and then we pass the parent in to delete contents, and those contents are deleted. Okay, now let's look at the render list function. That's the next one called in line. So we'll say const render list. And this would set into action the processes that render our to-do list. So we'll define a list inside of here, and we'll say to-do list. Remember, this is the new to-do list object we created at the beginning. And now we want to call in that method get list. Right now, of course, it would be an empty list, but we're still getting the list. And then we'll say list, and it's an array, so we can use for each, and this is for each item on the list. we will call a helper function, which is build list item, and we'll pass in the item from the array, that single item. We'll save that. So now we know we need a build list item function to help out our render list. So let's define that build list item, and it's going to accept item as a parameter. And now this function gets just a little longer because we're creating DOM elements like divs, and we're setting attributes. So we'll start out with a div, and really we could go back to our HTML and just take a quick peek, because what we're creating is what I commented out here that I could bring back in. And now I'll hide the file tree and give us a little more room. Right here, this is what we're creating. Now, why don't they show up, huh? Well, it could be that our clear list function is working. If we come back into our main.js file and come to the top and we comment out our clear list display function, now they load in just like they were. So we know our clear list display function is working. So that's great. And this is how they should look. And it's what we're going to be creating with this build list item. So once again, quick look at the HTML. And we're going to be creating a div with the class of item. And inside that div, we're going to have a checkbox input and a label. And there's several attributes that they'll have as well. So now, back at the JS, in our main.js file, let's do this build list item function. So we start with the div, document.create element, and we pass in a div. So we know that's the type of element we're creating. We've set it equal to the variable div, so then we can just say div.className to set the class equals item. Now, let's build our checkbox. So once again, document.create element. We have an input element that is a checkbox. And we'll say check.type equals checkbox. That's the attribute there. And then check.id equals the item we've passed in, which is a to-do item, so it has the method getID. That was our getter for the ID attribute. And then check.tabIndex, because it needs to have that tab index attribute, so it's part of the tab order, so we can tab between the items. So we'll set that tab index to 0. And that is good so far, and you can see how we're creating those elements. And there could be some of you that would say, hey, you should have a separate function for each one of these elements you're creating. And that is a possibility, because that would really break it down to doing one thing each. And I just haven't broken it out that far. We're going to end up with a function that has about 15 lines here. Right here, I'm going to add a comment, but we want to add a click listener to checkbox. And we pass in check, which would be the check variable. So this is going to be a helper function, and we will come back to that. Now we'll define a label variable, and we'll say document.create element, pass in label. Now our label is going to have a for attribute, but in JavaScript that is HTML4. Looks just a little different. That is item.getID, because you want the for attribute of the label to be identical to the ID of the checkbox. Okay, label.text content now. We're setting the actual text of the label. It would be item.getItem. And now we want to append what we've created. So div.append append child. So we have our div and we're going to append the checkbox. And then right after that we'll have div.append child and we're going to append the label. And now we need to go ahead and create the container, or at least select the container. We're not going to create the container. What am I thinking? So this is document.get element by ID, and it's our list items container. And from there we can just say container.append child and pass in the div. Well, that's all right. So all we haven't done is create that helper that adds the listener to the checkbox. But everything else looks good. So let's come back up because this was the helper to the render list. And here's the render list function. Well, the list is empty, so it doesn't have anything to render at this point. We're going to have to go back and tell it how to create an item very soon so we can start doing that. But right now, we can render the list, which calls the build list item function. And from there, we need to go ahead and create a helper function that is called add click listener to checkbox. So that way, when the user clicks on that checkbox, something happens. Now, checkboxes do have their natural behavior of adding a check to the box. We don't really have to do anything to make that happen. But let's create this helper function here that says add click listener to checkbox, and we're going to pass in the checkbox that we're adding the listener to. And now inside this function we can say checkbox.add event listener, listening for the click event, and we could pass in the event here, although we're not really doing anything with it. We've just listened for it, and now when it's clicked, we can call the to-do list. Remember, that's our object that we defined up in the global space above. That is our overall to-do list. And we can call remove item from list, because that's when we're checking it off. We want to remove an item. We can pass in the checkbox ID. And the checkbox ID that we had grabbed, or it has that attribute that was set, and we're grabbing that from the element itself. So there's the checkbox ID we're passing in. And now at this point, besides removing the item from the list there, and that is removing it from the object, we're removing the to-do item, we would also want to remove it from the persistent data. So I'm just putting a to-do reminder here, remove from persistent data, and we'll come back to that as well. And notice I also have a little extension I'm using for to-dos that does this, and we could look that up, but pretty much go to your extensions and search for to-do, and you'll find an extension that highlights to-dos for you. The one extra thing I want to add is this will happen so fast when we would check a box to remove it that I would prefer to slow that down, or at least not refresh the page so quickly that it's just a blur, because you get a little bit of satisfaction out of seeing the check mark in the box. Yes, I've checked this item off. So I want to use the set timeout that is built into the window object. This is one of those things that you could say window.setTimeout, but you don't have to use the word window. And so I'm using the set timeout, and inside this set timeout, I'm going to call the refresh the page function, and that will refresh the page, delete the previous items, load the new list, because we have added an item to the list. It doesn't just automatically add to the DOM. We have to once again pull that data from the DOM. And I'm going to set the timeout to 1 second. This is 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second. So we get the satisfaction of seeing that checkbox or item that we have worked hard on and checked off our to-do list for at least 1 second before it disappears. So we'll save that. And other than having a to-do for the persistent data, we have finished that. So now when we build a list item, it's going to add a click, and apparently I mistyped listener. It's going to add a click listener, if we spell that right, to every item when we build it. And we build these items in a loop. So for each item in the list, we build the item, so every item also gets a click listener attached to it. Now that we've completed the add click listener to checkbox function, except for the to-do that we have remaining, and the build list item that all comes back to our render list we called, we just have a couple of small items left in our refresh the page function. One is clear the item entry field, which is our text entry, and the other is set focus on item entry, which would just set the focus back here so we could start typing right away without having to click in the box or click a button or tab through. So let's go ahead and create those functions, and those are quick and easy as far as that goes. So we'll come down here under our add click listener to checkbox function, and we'll start with the clear item entry field function. Does not need a parameter. So all we need to do is select the item entry field, get element by ID, and that is new item. And then we'll set that value equal to a blank value. We'll save that, and that is that function. That just clears out the text input box. And the other function we needed was set focus on item entry. Once again, no parameters needed. We'll set the focus, element by ID, and we'll get that new item input again. And here we'll just say focus. And that will set the focus back to that input. And I've noticed we're still using the iPhone 5, the smallest view, which is what I like to do because it's always easier to expand and make it bigger. But we can go ahead and possibly expand our phone just a little. Let's get a different phone choice. Maybe an iPhone 8. And we can see fit to window. It'll let us go a little bigger there with a 91%. That's great. That gives us a nice clear view. It adds just a little space. I felt like the iPhone 5 look was a little cramped. So there we have everything needed in our refresh the page function. And it is a procedural function that calls these other four functions. And these functions, at least the first two, also had some helpers. So we've completed all of that. Now we're probably anxious to start adding items to our list and to see some of this in action for sure. So let's get started with that. What we need to do is add event listeners then in our initialize app or init app function. So we'll come back up to the top where we add the listeners. And let's go ahead and start with some of that. The first thing we want to do is select the entry form. And there we go, document.get element by ID once again, and it is the item entry form. So we've selected that entry form, and now we can say item entry form dot add event listener, and we're listening for the submit because this is a form. So when the form is submitted, listen for that submission event or submit event. And what we want to do, let me go ahead and save this real quick and show you why we want to do this. Right now, forms have the default behavior that they submit via a get method, even if you don't define that in your HTML. So watch the elements over here to the right. When I click the submit button, everything flashes. It actually reloads because it submits the form. We don't want that to happen. We want to handle the data ourselves. We don't need to submit that form. So what we want is an event, as we specified in our parameter, the event, prevent default, and that will prevent that from happening. So now when I click the button, watch over here, nothing flashes. We can click submit as much as we want to, but we've prevented the default behavior of the form, and it doesn't reload everything like the DOM. It happens so fast you don't really see it here, but you could see it here in the code. So we've done that, and now we need to essentially process the submission. And that's what I'm going to call this function. And that is, once again, a procedural function, a little bit larger, that does a few things when we process the submission. So we'll get started with that. We need to scroll all the way down underneath our set focus on item entry function, and we'll start defining the process submission function. No parameter necessary to start out with. The very first thing we need to do is grab the text, the item, what has been entered. So we'll say const new entry text, and we'll set that to a function named get new entry. And as you might guess, this function is just going to do the one thing, and that's what we want functions to do, if at all possible. Get new entry, and we're going to return the document.get element by ID, new item once again, value, but also trim that value. We don't want the white spaces to the left or the right that might exist. So we've got the new entry item now by calling that simple function. And now we'll say if the new entry text dot length is false, which would be 0. So that's how we can say if it is equal to 0. Return, just exit the function, and we're done. Nothing else needs to happen there. But if there is some length to the text, there's at least one character there, something that we want to put on our to-do list, we need to go ahead and process this submission. So first thing we need to do is get the next item ID, because we might already have items on our list. And if we don't, it's clearly going to be the first item, but we need to have a function to do that. So we're going to say calc next item ID, and now we need to create a helper function called that. So we'll start here, and we'll say calc next item ID, start the arrow function, and we'll add let next item ID equal 1, because that's what it will be if no items exist. So we might as well start out with that value. And then we'll grab the list from our to-do list object by calling the getList method. And just set that equal to list. And now I'll say if list.length greater than 0, the next item ID is going to equal, now we're going to refer to the last item on the list, and we do that by saying list.length minus 1, and that using bracket notation there with our list array, that would be the last item on the list. And now we could say get ID. We'll call the ID for that last item, and then we need to add 1 to it, and that would be the next item. And of course, if it was not greater than 0, then we just return the next item ID, which would be 1. And there is our calc next item function. Okay, so after we calc the next item ID, we need to go ahead and create an item. So now we say const to do item equals create new item. Now we've got a couple of pieces of data already, and since they exist, we need to go ahead and create this item. We say next item ID is passed in as a parameter, and also the new entry text is a parameter for creating that new item. Okay, creating the new item, we just scroll down below and create that function, and we'll say create new item, and we're going to set this equal to an arrow function actually also. So we'll say item ID, because we're passing in the next item ID, and then we'll say item text, because we've passed in the text as well. Oh yeah, arrow function, almost forgot again. And now we need to create a new to-do item. So we'll say to-do equals new to-do item. This is a new object created from our to-do item class. And we'll start using those methods. So we'll set the ID equal to item ID. And now we'll say to-do set item equal to item text. And then we'll just return the to-do. That was easy enough. So if we come back now, our to-do is held in this to-do item variable. Now that we have our to-do item, we can just call our to-do list into action. This is our to-do list object that we've created, and it has the add item to list method. So we just call that method and pass in the to-do item. Now, a note here again, another reference to a to-do. This is to-do in our code. This is where we would want to update our persistent data once again, because we've added a new item. So that would need to go into that storage as well. So what we're seeing is anytime we update our to-do list, whether it's adding an item or removing an item, we also need to update our persistent data. And then when this is all completed, we need to refresh the page again. And that is because we have added a new item, and so that page needs refreshed, and it will now show the new item as well. And it's not like refreshing a web page completely. This will happen so fast that you won't even realize that all the items have been deleted and shown again. It will look like just one new item appears. If you can believe it, we are almost finished with the app. We still need to add something for our clear button, and we need to handle our persistent data. One quick correction, this new to-do item needs to start with a capital T, as when we import these classes. You can see the lowercase t on my to-do here, but when we scroll to the top, we can see we're importing these with capital T's, capital letters, because they're classes that we have imported. So that needs to be a to-do item with a capital T. Now, that said, let's go ahead and check out our process submission function, where we could say eat and we could say sleep. You notice the focus goes right back to the input, and we can say code, and that all works like we want. But we could also say sleep more and tab over to the submit button and hit enter there. And when we hit enter, it goes back and sets the focus back into the text input like we need. So that's also very convenient, and that submit function is doing all of that. Not submit, the submit event is what is happening there, and that is triggering the rest of that. We didn't need to have any other click event, listener, or anything else. It's just the forms submit event that is making that happen. When that fires, whether it's from the submit button or from us hitting enter, because this is a one input form, so we can just press the enter key and it works just as well. And of course, we can tab through all of these, and you see the items get underlined, and the hover and focus, we're focused on the clear button, there we're focused on the submit button, or focused back on the text input, all work like they should. So let's go ahead and finish up this app by adding a listener for the clear event button, or the clear button, and listen for its click event. And then we could also finish up by adding the persistent data. So let's scroll to the top and add the other listener that is missing for that clear event, or the click event on the clear button. Starting out, we'll define our clear items variable, and we'll grab the element we need, which is the button document get element by ID once again, and we'll grab the clear items ID, which is the button. And now we'll say clear items.add event listener. We'll listen for the click on that button. You can pass in the event, even though we won't really need the event in there. And we want to say get the list, which is the to-do list object we've created, and we'll say get list again. Once we have that, we'll say if list.length. That means if it has a length that is not 0, if there's length to the list, we want to use a confirm, a little confirm window. So we'll say confirm, and the message is, are you sure you want to clear the entire list? Question mark. And of course we need a semicolon there. I want to go ahead and wrap this so it's not scrolling off the screen. There we go. Are you sure you want to clear the entire list? And after we ask that, if confirmed, because confirmed will, the confirm window will return, or the confirm pop-up will return a Boolean, so it's either true or false, whether they click OK or cancel. And so if confirmed, if they click OK and it comes back true, we'll say to-do list, which is our object, call the clear list method that we've already defined. To do here, update persistent data once again, because we've cleared out the full list. So at that point, the persistent data should also get emptied out. And then we'll say refresh the page, because anything that was displayed should be deleted from the list. And so that is the event listener for the clear button. So let's add a few things. Let's say eat, sleep, code, and now let's click the clear button. And we get our confirm. We'll say OK, and it cleared the full list. Likewise, if we said eat, sleep, code, we had two different ones, it doesn't really matter, and we clicked, and then we got the confirm, and we click cancel, then it doesn't, and that's the behavior we wanted. So that is great, and that finishes the clear button action. So now we need to handle this persistent data, and that is in several places in our codes here. So let's look from the top. Let's look for all the to-do lists we might see. And the very first thing we see is update persistent data. And I think we're going to see that several times throughout there. See, we're on line 30. We have an update persistent data. Where's our next to-do? On line 88, remove from persistent data. And that could just be update the persistent data again, because we could just grab the list after it's been removed from the list. And then on line 109, we have an update persistent data. So we need to do that in several places. Let's just add our update persistent data right under our add click listener to checkbox function. And it's not a big function at all. Update persistent data. We're going to pass in the list array. And there we'll use the local storage, and we'll set the item. And now we need to name what we're going to call our storage. I'm going to call it my to-do list. And now we need to use JSON stringify. Local storage works great with JSON. So we're going to stringify our list array, because local storage only stores strings anyway. It will convert it even if we don't use the JSON. So we might as well use JSON and take advantage of that. And that is the full function that we need to update the persistent data. So now let's just look for the places that call for that persistent data to be updated, and call this function, update persistent data, and inside we'll always pass the to-do list, get list. So as long as the list has been updated, whether it's had something removed or something added, this will update the persistent data. So I'll copy that and we'll just look for these other places in our code that needed it. Any other to-dos highlighted? I think there might be one at the top. Yes, there is. Now we have updated our persistent data in all of the places we need it, so when we come back, if we leave the site and come back maybe even a week later, our to-do list will still remain, and the only thing we haven't done now is one of the things we talked about at the very beginning, and that is to load the list object. We need to load it out of our web storage and read that into our app right when the app starts up. So let's call that function, and we'll just call it load list object. And then we get to define that function. So we'll put it, let's put it right above the refresh the page function, because that's where it's called in our code as well. So load list object, make it an arrow function. And besides the event listeners, and of course the init app that it's within, is the very first function that actually does something other than listening for the app to start. So what we'll start out with is defining our stored list. Here we'll say local storage dot get item, and we're getting my to-do list out of local storage. So now that we've grabbed the list, if it exists, we need to see if it exists. And I'm going to say if the type of, so I'm checking the type of data that's coming out here, the type of the stored list. If it's not equal to string, then it's really not what we're expecting. So just abort mission at that point. So if the stored list is not equal to a string, and it should be string data, that's definitely what we're storing. We're stringifying JSON and putting it in there. But if it's not, get out of there. So if the list exists and it's what we expect, it will be stringified JSON data. So now we can say const parse list and call JSON parse and put the stored list in here and parse that out. And now we should have our parsed list that would be the object we brought back in. So now we can say parsed list for each, because this JSON is going to have our item objects in it. So we have item objects. So we'll say for each item object, create a new to-do item. And this is because our to-do items have methods. So we're not just pulling the data out. We want those methods. But when we stringify, or even if we didn't stringify, if we just stuck them into the local storage or with the web storage, they lose those methods. Those methods don't stick with them when we pull them back out. So we want to just create new items again. Remember, this is when the app loads. So we know we have a list of items. Now we're actually making each item a to-do object again and storing it in the list. So this is why we take this approach. So we create a new item, a new to-do item, and we have to call our create new item function that we previously defined. And we can pass in the item object. Now here we don't get to use the getter or the setter because they don't exist. So we have to refer to those properties, and we refer to the item object underscore ID and item object dot underscore item. And then we call that to-do list object that we created at the top, so it already exists. And then we call the method from it, add item to list, and we add the new to-do item we just created. Of course, we do this for each item on the list. Okay, let's clear out our list. Let's add some more items. Let's say we need to get eggs, milk, bread, and chips. Can't live without chips. Maybe tacos too. Okay, we've got eggs, milk, bread, chips, and tacos. Let's check our storage. We go to the Application tab, and now we might have to pull this over a little further. But we do have some local storage here on my to-do list. And down here we can see each item actually. And here is the ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we've got eggs, milk, bread, chips, and tacos. Let's check some more of our app. Let's delete bread. There's the nice checkbox for 1 second before it's gone. And now you can see we've got items 1, 2, 4, and 5. So our persistent data updated right away, and that's exactly what we wanted. And maybe I'll go ahead and delete one more. Let's get rid of the chips. Okay, great. Now let's add something here. Let's say we want to add noodles. You can see we created the next item ID based on the last one. Even though 3 and 4 were missing, we didn't create an item with an ID of 3. We grabbed the last item and added 1, and it creates the next item ID as it should. I believe we are finished creating our app. So let's review everything. I'll scroll this back over, give us a little more room, and let's even close this out and see how it looks on a bigger screen. So we could really add a longer item. Go to the store and buy milk, if I could spell milk, eggs, and cheese. And it's there, but we can add more and more and more and more and more and even one more. And now let's scroll, and our sticky item entry works also. It stops at the top. That's great. So now we can click, click, click. Can we click 2 at once? Yes. Just have to be quick or it disappears and comes back. So if we went click and then hesitated, it would maybe not work as well. But we could try to debug it and even refine this. There's a lot of room for improvement in this app. This is a very basic to-do list application, and I'm sure you can add more features that would even make it better. And of course, in the long run, you might want to create an app that will handle more than one list, and you could select which list you're working with. All right, let's test out our to-do web app. And the first thing we want to do is activate the Chrome Vox screen reader and see how it responds. We've already used the functionality. We know we can add items and remove items with a mouse. So we're really going to test out the accessibility features. So go to the 3 dots in Chrome and then choose More Tools and choose Extensions. From Extensions, you'll want to activate the Chrome Vox Classic Edition. If you don't have that extension, go to chrome.google.com and let's see what the rest of that address is. It looks like, I think you could just search for the Chrome Web Store, but it's chrome.google.com/webstore/category/extensions, and that would probably get you there. But go there and search for Chrome Vox, V-O-X, and I can expand the browser a little, I believe, so you can see that. And choose the Chrome Vox Classic extension. That's what you want. Let's see if I can bring this back where we had it. There we go, right about there. So we'll choose this, and it's going to start talking to us. Now I'll choose the to-do list tab.
Chrome Vox to-do list tab.
And it's ready to go.
Edit text.
So that's our text box. We can tab through.
Add new item to list. Enter a new to-do item with hint add item. Edit text. Add new item to list. Section. Remove all items from the list.
I don't think I like that so well. I think we need to change our section and maybe add a tab indexed to our H1 so it
To-do
announces
list remove
the
all
section.
items from the list. Section.
There we go. Every time I click, it's reading something off. Let's go ahead and try adding
Edit
an item.
text.
So I'll say eat.
T.
And I'm typing a little fast. If I type slower,
E, A, T.
I'll press enter.
Eat, deleted.
Oh, I don't like that either. I don't like how it says eat deleted. We want it to say eat and then added or item added, something like that. Let's try another one.
S.
Sleep.
Eep.
And
Address and search bar.
okay, we tabbed clear off the page.
127.0.0.1:55. Edit text. Add new item to list. Enter a new to-do item with hint add item.
So
Edit text.
That's interesting. After I pressed the enter button, or pressed enter when I had the focus on the button, it just went back and read the item entry field again because we switched the focus back to that. So we'll go ahead and enter code.
C. D. Code. Deleted.
Definitely don't like that. Let's tab down and see what happens when we remove something.
Add new item to list. Section. Remove. Eat. Checkbox not checked. Sleep. Checkbox not checked. Checked. Enter a new to-do item with hint add item. Edit text section.
So it really didn't say it removed the item. And I pressed the space bar, not enter, to actually check the checkbox, which is the actual behavior that I was expecting. So there's a couple of things here we want to change. Let's get to work on just a few things we can fix in this web app. Okay, I want to start with just a little bit of code cleanup, and that's always good to do as you're wrapping up a project. The very first thing is we get to the colors, and I'm remembering that I really didn't use the button dash hover color, and we can verify that by selecting the Sass folder and then right-clicking and choosing, let's see, find in folder. And I'm just going to paste the name in there, so this will search all of the files inside the Sass folder. And yes, we've only got this one occurrence, which is right here. So we can just get rid of this definition as part of our cleanup. Save that file. And what else are we looking for? Oh yeah, I used MP. Really wasn't thinking about it, and I meant to use MQ, and I used it throughout. So we can also search for this within the Sass folder and see how many occurrences of MP, or actually MP and the beginning parentheses might be a little easier to find exactly what we're looking for. So if we do that and choose find in folder, we have 4 results in 3 files, and we can go to each one of those results. So here's the very first one, and what I want to do is change that to a Q for media query. If I had even been thinking about it, that only makes sense. Okay, now we have 3 results in 3 files because it automatically updates. So now I'll go here, and we need to change the rest of these to match our definition. And that's the 2 results inside of the base. Now we've got 1 in the list container. And we've got 1 in the new item entry. With that fix in place, I want to go back to the HTML and add that tab index to the header. And that way, when we tab using the screen reader into this section, it's going to read the to-do list and not the remove all items, because that's not what this section is about. It's really about the to-do list. Okay, the last thing we need to do is going to take just a little bit more work in our JavaScript, and we'll go ahead and get rid of the file tree so we have some more room. And this was when we added the item, the screen reader was saying deleted, because immediately following pressing enter and the item being added to our list, we were clearing out this text field, and so it said deleted. Likewise, when we checked a box, instead of saying removed and say code removed or eat removed, it simply said checkbox checked and then went back here. And we could make this much more informational. So we're mostly going to do this in JavaScript. there is one thing we want to change actually in the HTML. So I will go to the HTML first, hide that file tree. So we're in our list container section, and then we're in the list items section, right underneath the list items section, but still inside the list container section. Going to just put a paragraph element, and I'm going to give this an ID of confirmation because we just want an audible confirmation. I need to put a little more than that. I'm also going to put a class equal to confirmation. And I'm going to set an aria-live attribute. And this will be set to assertive because that means it's going to read whatever happens in this element immediately. Even if it interrupts what it's saying, it's going to be assertive about it. You can also set this to polite and it will wait, but we want it to say right away what it is doing. And this will be, say, eggs added, or added to the list, or we could say eggs removed or eggs removed from the list, something like that. So whatever content we put in here. And that's all we need to do in the HTML is add this paragraph block element and put the ID class and the aria live attribute and set it to assertive. We'll save that, and let's make sure, I need to drag this over just a little bit more. We're not watching the Sass. Let's go ahead and do that. So it updates the CSS and compiles it as we go. Continue watching even though I closed that window. And now inside the, not the new item entry, inside the list container is where we have added this. And inside that list container, we're going to go to the very bottom underneath the label and underneath the item area here. There we are, you can see that. Because this is not an item, it's actually in the list container section, which we're still within. And we can just say dot confirmation, which is the class we applied to our paragraph element. And I'm going to do the same thing you saw me do with the label for our text entry. We're going to have an absolute position, and then we're going to set it minus 10,000 pixels to the left. So this is going to be off screen. It's nothing we need to see on screen. We can use the app as intended already that way when we look at it. But if someone needs a screen reader, they need this audible update. So we're going to actually put the update information in this paragraph, in the confirmation. And since it has that aria live attribute, it will read that confirmation with the screen reader. So now all we need to do is get to the JavaScript and go ahead and create the functions that will enable this to happen. Okay, I'm going to scroll down in the JavaScript. We're going to scroll way down here towards the end. And we've got our process submission. And then we add the item to the list. And we update the persistent data. And this would be a good time to give that screen reader confirmation that we want to do. So let's create a function called update screen reader confirmation. And let's give this function two parameters. One, we want to put the new entry text in because that is the item that we're adding to the list. So that's the new entry text as a parameter. The other one, let's call it action verb. And this is whatever we want to kind of say after we add it. So we could just say added or added to list, something like that. I'll just call it action verb as a parameter. So let's take this function name and go to the bottom of the file here underneath the create new item. And we'll create a function called update screen reader confirmation. And it's going to accept the new entry text. And it's going to accept an action verb. And since we're calling that up here, now that we've talked about that, really we don't want to say action verb here. We want to say what we're doing. So let's say added. That is our action verb for now. Now in the function, we're going to get that element, document get element by ID, and we gave it an ID of confirmation. And from there, we can access the text content, and we can set that text content equal to a template literal. So we can put these parameters right inside, and we can say new entry text. Imagine we added tacos to our list. So we'll say new entry text, and then space, and action verb, which is added. So we could say tacos added when we're finished. I'll go ahead and put a period there just to make it a sentence, even if it's a brief one. And we'll save that. Let me go ahead and wrap that code so we can see it all at once. The reason this is white, I am not sure why this is white right now. Something seems off. I know what it is. Been staring at code for too long. I forgot to make it an arrow function. There we go. So there's our full function, update screen reader confirmation. And this will accept, say, tacos and added, and then it will set that text content to that confirmation paragraph that we have for the screen reader. And since it has the ARIA live attribute, the screen reader will read it immediately as it's updated. And so that is why we have it in our process submission. We update the persistent data. The very first thing we do is add the new to-do item to the list. Then we update the persistent data, and then we give that confirmation, and it will read it right as it refreshes the page and shows the new item. So that is what we need there. Now there's one other area, and that is when we remove an item. And that is just a little more complex. So let's scroll up to that click listener we have for the checkboxes where we actually remove the item. And you can see we access the to-do list and we remove an item from the list. And once again, we update the persistent data. And right after that, or even before the persistent data, either way, it would be a great place to put that update screen reader confirmation. So I'll just put it after because that's what we did before. I can say update screen reader confirmation, and this is going to accept some removed text, and we haven't defined that yet. And then we'll say deleted, or we could say removed from list. Let's do that. I don't think we need the period there though, because we already put that in our template literal. Okay, so we need to define this removed text. Now, what could we do to do that? We have to think about this. Where is the text? It's not in the checkbox, it's in the label. So we need to write a function, a helper function, that is going to grab that label text based on the checkbox ID. So let's do it right after our removed item from list where we worked with the checkbox ID. And we could say const remove text, because that's what we're passing in, is the remove text. Let's call this function get label text, and we're going to pass in the checkbox.id. So we'll pass in the ID of the checkbox. Now let's define that function just right underneath. It's called get label text. It's going to accept a checkbox ID parameter. And now we're going to return what we find here. And so we'll get element by ID. And let's just go ahead and select the checkbox with the ID. And then we can say next element sibling. So that is the element right beside it. And that's what we're doing, the very next element. And that is the label that we need. And then we can grab that text content from the label. We'll save that. And now that should work to grab the label text and save it in remove text. And you know what? I want to put the update persistent data above that just so we have these two lines together that we created. And now when we remove an item by checking the box, it should once again update that paragraph, and that paragraph with the screen reader will say removed from list. So we could say tacos removed from list or tacos added And those are the action verbs that we have got to pass. Quick fix here, I discovered one error. I put a colon instead of a semicolon after this line. We've got to fix that. And now we're ready to try out our additions to our web app. Okay, let's try out the new additions to the web app, especially for the screen reader.
To-do list, tab.
And let's add tacos.
T-C-O-S. Tacos added.
Yes, that's what we wanted. Now let's add salsa.
S-A. Salsa added.
Excellent.
Add new item to list. Section. To-do list.
That's
Heading
what
1.
we wanted too. We wanted to announce the to-do list instead of going straight to the clear button.
Remove all items from the list. Button. Eat. Checkbox not checked. Code. Checkbox not checked. Tacos. Checkbox not checked. Salsa. Checkbox not checked. Salsa remove. Edit text section.
Well, it almost got removed out. That's not
Add new
bad.
item section.
See if we
Remove.
can do that
Eat.
again.
Checkbox not checked. Checked. Eat removed from list. Enter a
Okay.
new to-do item with hint add item.
And there you have it, our to-do list web app project with HTML5, CSS3 that is compiled from Sass, and JavaScript. And we made it mobile first and responsive for all sizes of viewports. We made it accessible, and therefore we can use the app just with a keyboard, or we can even use it with the screen reader if necessary. And then we used persistent data so we could close out of the app and come back to it whenever we want to and still have our to-do list items. Of course, this app still has a lot of room for improvement, and I'm sure you can make your own. Please leave comments and let me know what you're going to do to improve the app. Thanks for watching.